Physiological Psychology. Study Session 1. The meaning and scope of physiological psychology. Introduction. This study session introduces you to the meaning and scope of the field of physiological psychology. Highlights include the scientific basis of views in physiological psychology, with emphasis on the relevance of findings in earlier scientific experiments in gaining a better understanding in the field. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Define physiological psychology. 2. Explore various scientific experiments related to various aspects of human functioning. 3. Apply knowledge about the various research investigations in explaining human behavior. Meaning of physiological psychology. Physiological psychology is the science that studies the biological basis of behavior. For this reason, physiological psychology is sometimes referred to as biological psychology, biopsychology, or psychobiology. This means that the physiological psychologist studies the biological factors as opposed to economic, social, or cultural factors that causes or constitutes behavior. Although the expression biological basis of behavior refers to a large number of physiological processes, contemporary usage equates biological basis with neural substrates. Davis et al. 1988. Consequently, physiological psychology today is a synonym of behavioral neuroscience rather than a synonym of psychobiology as it is used in the 1950s. A contemporary definition of physiological psychology would refer, therefore, not to the biological basis of behavior, but to the neural substrates of behavior, including the special class of behavior called mental activity. The name physiological psychology has been adopted by numerous authors, although several alternative names have been proposed, such as biopsychology, psychobiology, neuropsychology, neurobehavioral science, behavioral neuroscience, and others. In certain instances, names that might seem alternative names actually designate subspecialties of physiological psychology, such as neuropsychology, psychophysiology, and neuroethiology. Scope of physiological psychology. Physiological psychologists study behavioral phenomena that can be observed in non-human animals. They attempt to understand the physiology of biology, the role of the nervous system interacting with the rest of the body, especially the endocrine system, which secretes hormones in controlling behavior. They study such topics as sensory process, sleep, emotional behavior, ingestive behavior, aggressive behavior, sexual behavior, parental behavior, and learning and memory. They also study animal models of disorders that affect humans, such as anxiety, depression, obsession and compulsion, phobias, psychosomatic illnesses, and schizophrenia. Although physiological psychology is the original name of this field, several other terms are now in general use, such as biological psychology, biopsychology, psychobiology, and behavioral neuroscience. Physiological psychology belongs to the larger field of neuroscience. Neuroscientists concern themselves with all aspects of the nervous system, its anatomy, chemistry, physiology, development, and functioning. The research of neuroscientists range from the study of molecular genetics to the study of social behavior. Most professional physiological psychologists are employed by colleges and universities where they are engaged in training and research. Others are employed by institutions devoted to research. For example, laboratories owned and operated by national governments or by private philanthropic organizations. A few work in industries, usually for pharmaceutical companies that are interested in assessing the effects of drugs on behavior. To become a professor or independent researcher, one must receive a doctorate. Nowadays, most physiological psychologists spend 2 years in temporary postdoctoral positions working in the laboratory of a senior scientist to gain more research experience. Two other fields often overlap with that of physiological psychology. They are neurology and experimental neuropsychology. Neurologists are physicians involved in the diagnosis and treatment of diseases of the nervous system. Experiments related to various aspects of human behavior. A number of examples and counterexamples of typical experimental studies will help delineate the boundaries of physiological psychology. Two of the most vivid examples of the study of the neural basis of behavior are the evocation of visual and auditory experiences by electrical stimulation of specific sites on the cerebral cortex in humans and the evocation of what seems to be the ultimate sensation of pleasure by stimulation of the diencephalic structures in rats. On the other hand, the study of the areas of the brain involved in muscular movement evoked by electrical stimulation of the motor cortex would belong to neurology or neurophysiology rather than physiological psychology, since only the neural component and not the behavioral one is being investigated. Analogously, the evocation of the thermoregulatory behavior by thermal stimulation of the hypothalamus belongs to physiological psychology, whereas the study of electrophysiological characteristics of thermal receptors in the brain does not. Naturally, this distinction implies no attribution of scientific merit or of conceptual incommensurability. Electrophysiology is as scientifically important as physiological psychology, and an electrophysiological experiment that investigates, for instance, the firing characteristics of thermal receptors in the monkey's hand is extremely valuable for physiological psychology if the results are correlated with results from psychophysical experiments on thermal discrimination in humans. The same may be said about the study of the relationship between the electrical activity of single neurons in the inferior collicus of a newborn mouse and the ability of these animals to respond to acoustic stimuli. Many additional examples may be given. The mapping of brain regions that are active during ingestive behavior and the inhibition of ingestive behavior by infusion of nutrients directly into the rat brain are examples of research in physiological psychology. On the other hand, the study of the effects of changes in taste and nutrient content of food on ingestive behaviors in humans and the study of how taste aversion is learned in rats belongs to behavioral psychology or regulatory psychology rather than to physiological psychology, since only the behavioral component and not the neural one is being investigated. Analogously, the investigation of the effect of cerebellar lesions on emotional behavior in rats or of cortical lesions on sensory discrimination or of hippocampal lesions on memory or of cortical lesions on learning capability or of hypothalamic lesions on thermoregulatory behavior are all examples of research in physiological psychology. On the other hand, the study of the sensory determinants of suckling behavior in weaning rats, or of social relations among non-human primates, or of the punishment procedure in operant conditioning, or of the behavioral thermal preferences of the rat belong to behavioral psychology and ethology rather than to physiological psychology. As before, this distinction implies no attribution of scientific merit or of conceptual incommensurability. Purely behavioral studies are just as important as studies that examine the neural correlates of behavior. In fact, physiological psychology, behavioral psychology, neurophysiology, and regulatory psychology are all interrelated sciences, except for the few exceptions described later on in this book. All of these sciences contribute to the advancement of our knowledge of how the animal body, including the brain, performs the various tasks required for the survival of the individual and the species and for the enjoyment of human existence. Implications to human behavior. Suppose a biological psychologist were to tell you that the anger you experience is merely a reflection of a pattern of activity in your brain, and that the romantic attraction you feel towards someone is the result of activity in another area of your brain. The psychologist goes on to say that you are better at English than at algebra because the left half of your brain is a few millimeters thicker than the right half, and explains each of your other behaviors in terms of your other features of your brain. Would you feel opposed to these explanations? Even though explaining this may be a little difficult at times, it is largely plausible. However, it is additionally necessary to make a distinction between two types of biological explanation, i.e., biological factors that force a behavior to occur and biological factors that enable a behavior to occur. In some cases, the properties of the brain or the rest of the body could force a behavior to occur. For example, people sweat because they become too hot. The pupils of the eye constrict in pressure of bright light. In some other cases, biological influence may make a behavior possible but not absolutely necessary. For example, the properties of your brain may predispose you to aggression, but you may choose to caution yourself from attacking someone else. Study session summary. In this study session, you learned that the field of physiological psychology seeks to explain animal and human behavior from biological perspectives. It stresses the relationship between changes in animal and human histochemistry on internal mechanisms for controlling responses to internal and external stimuli, and by extension, human functioning depicted in overt and covert behavior. End of study session 1. Thanks for listening.